I just want to say, were you able to watch the? Or I want to ask, were you able to watch the Timberwolves Heat game last night?
No, I didn't catch it.
Look, if you have any interest in watching a replay of a random basketball game, I could make an argument that that was the highest quality NBA game of the season.
Really?
It was an incredible matchup, an incredible basketball game. Chris Finch has the Timberwolves playing, just operating at such a high level, and I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but we need to acknowledge that Rudy Gobert has just become one of the most underrated players in the NBA. And if you rewatch that game, just watch Rudy Gobert. Watch what he does to Bam Adebayo, and honestly, the whole Heat offense down the stretch of that game. He is this whole idea, and it makes me think of Donovan Mitchell. Donovan Mitchell was never the best player on those Jazz teams. Like, when are we going to talk, or at least the most impactful player? All the data reflects that. And I know we have this mind's bias to, well, the game gets tight. You're putting the ball in Donovan Mitchell's hands, not in Rudy Gobert's hands. And that in and of itself places a higher emphasis on one side of the ball than the other side of the ball. And it also places the highest emphasis on specifically what's going on with the ball in your hands. And it ignores that, hey, maybe actually there are all these other things that elevate the ball handler's ability to do the things that he does with the ball in his hands. We don't know in our mind the optimal way to weigh those things. The data doesn't care about how to weigh those things. It's just telling you what's happening. And for 4 or 5 years in Utah, the data told us that Rudy Gobert was the solar system in Utah. He drove all of their success. And that's probably why it was so glaring when they failed in the playoffs when Rudy Gobert was, quote unquote, being exposed, because without Rudy Gobert being his most impactful, that Jazz team just wasn't very good. They needed Rudy Gobert to be his most impactful. So people always saw it as dunking on Rudy Gobert. Like, see, he's actually not that good a defender. But it's like, no, this actually exposed how not mediocre, but how overrated the rest of the Jazz players were, because without Rudy Gobert being his best, they just fell off a cliff.
Just to jump in real quick, because I think this is really interesting what you're saying. I'm sure there are a lot of people who were saying some of these things. I wasn't as involved in Twitter and social at the time. So at least for me, my thought was never like, I thought it was clear that Gobert was the most impactful player on those teams. Like, I don't think it was really even close. Like, I don't even have the data in front of me, but I don't think it was like Mitchell and Gobert. I think it was like clearly Gobert is the most impactful player on this team. I think that the issue for Gobert was that he could be schemed off the court. Right, like that was, and the fact that he schemed off the court doesn't mean that he's a bad defensive player. It showed how good a defensive player he was, how much of essentially a heliocentric defensive player he was, and the fact that without him, if he could be schemed off the court, this team sucks. Like, this team can't. Not that they suck, but they're not anywhere near as good as they could be with Gobert on the court. So the issue to me with Gobert was like, could he just be schemed off the court because of his inability to shoot and really do much with the ball in his hands? That to me, that was the point. And any conversation that was like, oh, but like Mitchell has the ball in his hands like late in the game, like I hate that's a pet peeve of mine. And it's, I know we want to talk about pet peeves at some point. That's a pet peeve of mine because like we're talking about the last few minutes of a game, like by virtue of the idea of it being the last few minutes of the game, there's a first majority of minutes of the game, and those minutes count more than the last few minutes. So I just have never understood that at all. I think I just wanted to say, from my standpoint, that was the issue with Gobert, not that he wasn't that good a defender, he wasn't as impactful as Mitchell or or he didn't have the ball in his hands the last few minutes of the game. All that stuff is silly talk to me. It was just about the fact that he could be schemed off the court, which completely eradicated his impact, obviously, if he's not there.
Yeah. Really great point. And to try to marry some data to it, the 2020-2021 Jazz, everybody remembers that team. They were the 1 seed. They lost to a Kawhi Leonard-less Clippers in the second round, where Ty Lue basically said, we're going to play Terrence Mann at center when they were down. They were down like 30 at home in game 6 against the Jazz. and they stuck Terrence Mann in at center, and just had one of the most incredible comebacks you'll ever see. Everybody remembers that team. That year, the Jazz were plus 15.9 per 100 when Rudy Gobert played, minus 2 per 100 when Rudy Gobert sat. He was the only negative when he was off the court. Everybody else's off-court minutes were positive. On the other end of the spectrum, you had Donovan Mitchell. The Jazz were plus 7.9 per 100 when he played. They were plus 10.3 per 100 when he sat. So they were actually worse with him on the court than off it. That's almost 20 points per 100 difference between the two players in terms of net court differential. I'm 100% sure if you looked at EPM or you looked at LeBron, any of the advanced data, they would also reflect that Gobert just was the most impactful player on that team. So yes, to anybody who loves basketball, go watch that Heat Timberwolves game. Great, absolutely great high quality basketball game. And it showcased Gobert's skill set. And I think, I should have mentioned this earlier, and I'll be curious to hear what you think about this. As impactful as Gobert was with Mitchell, something that my brother talked about all the time is that there's an interconnectivity between the impact that two guys like that can make. And an example he often used, he used two examples, the 2001 Sixers and the 2011 Bulls. And if you were to look at the analytics of both of those teams, Allen Iverson won MVP, Derrick Rose won MVP in 2011, and Iverson won in 2001. But if you look at the analytics, most stat junkies would say, well, they actually won because of defense. And Rose and Iverson were not the strongest defenders on either of those teams. They were both top seeds because they had the best defenses in the league. But my brother would always argue that, well, these defenders are allowed to be their most impactful, the most impactful versions of themselves, because there's an elite scorer who can carry a super high usage and drag an offense to even mediocrity. That allows flawed defensive heavy players to be the best versions of themselves. So, as much credit as I do want to give, Gobert for those Jazz teams, and even as much as the data can tell us that, hey, the Jazz did fine when Gobert played and Mitchell didn't, I think in the macro sense, you have to give Mitchell at least a little bit of credit for for not allowing Gobert's offensive weaknesses to have a bigger light shown on them. Because if they had a worse offensive creator as their best player, I think all of a sudden Gobert might have some more responsibilities and he might hurt the team more. And to bring this back to the Nets and their potential, bringing Mitchell on board, Claxton is a very limited offensive player. He can pretty much only dunk, and, he has a little baby hook with his left hand, but you don't want him doing more outside of that. And he has a very high defensive ceiling. If all of a sudden you bring a guy like Donovan Mitchell in, he's going to allow Claxton to be the best version of himself because he takes all of those responsibilities away from flawed offensive players. So I think that we could see the Nets take a big leap forward if they were able to get Mitchell and not give up too much.
I totally agree with that analysis and evaluation. I totally agree. I think that it's almost like you have a flawed. It makes sense. You have a flawed defensive player and an incredible offensive player, and then you have a flawed offensive player and an incredible defensive player. Like, you think those two might go well together? Like, I think, but it's even like you explained. Like, it's not just that they're flaws, that they cover up for each other's flaws, that they allow each other's strengths to blossom as well. Like, it's there's space, right? It's almost like when you do sound engineering or something like that, and you are doing sound mixing, there's frequencies that you have to blend with one another. So in order to have the lows be able to shine through of the kick drum, you have to like make sure that the lows of the other instruments are kind of reduced. So you can pull down those frequencies on those other instrumental sounds, and you can let the lows from those the sounds that you really want the lows from, the kicks, the bass drums, you can let those really shine through. And it's necessary to have that push and pull, that dynamic where you drop the lows on one and you are able to let the lows shine through on those others, and that's necessary, or else everything's going to get really muddy. And that's the synergistic effect that you're kind of describing, I think, in a basketball game as well. So you kind of almost have to have that in order to have guys really maximize their strengths on either end. And so I really like when teams are built that way. And also, like, I mean, yeah.
Can I just get in here?
For sure.
I'm sorry. I just want to say it works the other way too. Like if Mitchell's a flawed defensive player, having someone who doesn't force him, who doesn't amplify, maybe Mitchell's not the best example because I know people like his defense when he's locked in, but over the totality of a season, he's never been super impactful. But if you have an offense heavy defense light player, having a guy like Gobert or Claxton or Mitchell Robinson who can disallow the opponent from amplifying those deficiencies, that is equally impactful. And I do think we have to emphasize both equally. It's not just the offensive player who's helping elevate the defensive player. It works vice versa too.